Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's, excuse me. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Jean Andrews Distinguished Lecture for 2021. This event is actually 2 years in the making, as we've had to reschedule it several times due to travel bans and pandemic waves, and we are thrilled to be able to bring this event to you virtually tonight. I'm going to share my screen with you. So I would first like to acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Linda de Graffenried, who is the faculty lead for these events. And even when you're putting them together virtually, it's still a ton of work. And I would also like to acknowledge the officers of the Nutrition Graduate Student Association for their significant contribution to the planning and organization of this event. And I would also like to recognize Steph Tran, who has been invaluable in setting up the administrative side of this event. So I am extremely delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Ann McTiernan. As you will soon hear, Dr. McTiernan is a passionate physician scientist who is dedicated to improving cancer outcomes through lifestyle interventions that include diet and physical activity. Dr. McTiernan received her bachelor's degree in sociology from Boston University in 1974 and a master's degree in medical sociology from SUNY Buffalo in 1976. She went on to obtain her Ph.D. in epidemiology from the University of Washington in 1982, and she worked as a postdoctoral fellow for several years following her graduate school. It was during that time that she began to think about becoming a physician. And despite being a non-traditional student and a mother of two, she completed her medical degree in internal medicine from New York Medical College in 1989. She is currently a professor of epidemiology and geriatrics at the University of Washington's Schools of Public Health and Medicine, and she is a full member in the Public Health Sciences Division of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. During medical school, Dr. McTiernan developed a passion for understanding how lifestyle changes could affect cancer outcomes. She's been a pioneer in women's health research, leading national studies that investigate the effects of obesity, diet, and exercise on breast cancer risk and prognosis. Her research focuses on identifying ways to prevent new or recurrent breast cancer with physical activity, obesity prevention and treatment, and chemo prevention. Her ultimate goal is to reduce cancers caused by excess weight and sedentary lifestyles and improve survival for all cancer patients. And she's a researcher who walks the talk, incorporating physical activity into her own life and leading by example. In addition to publishing over 400 manuscripts, which is pretty amazing, Dr. McTiernan has also published multiple books, including Breast Fitness, which provides a roadmap for all of us for how exercise can reduce risk for and recurrence of breast cancer. She has edited 2 state-of-the-art books on improving cancer prevention and treatment through lifestyle changes, and she's also published 2 amazing memoirs, Starved, A Nutrition Doctor's Journey from Empty to Full, and her most recent book was just came out, Cured, A Doctor's Journey from Panic to Peace. If you read either of these books, both of which are pretty amazing, you know that Dr. McTiernan is an amazing example of resilience and dedication, and she's a person who will not stop until she finds a solution for improving cancer outcomes. So before we turn it over to Dr. McTiernan, I'm going to ask Matthew Jeans, who is the president of our Nutrition Graduate Student Association and the Jean Andrews Graduate Fellow for 2021, to give you a little bit of background of the history of the award and to present the award to Dr. McTiernan. Matthew, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Bray, and thank you everyone who's joining us in tonight virtually. And the President Emeritus, Brittany Harlow, will also be speaking tonight on the award. So the Jean Andrews Centennial Faculty Fellowship in Human Nutrition was established by the Board of Regents of the University of Texas System in 1983 and served as an endowment from Dr. Jean Andrews, matched by the University of Texas at Austin during its centennial year to benefit the College of Natural Sciences. Dr. Andrews was an alumna of human ecology And she was a unique scholar who explored and mastered the academic disciplines that reflect not only the human experience, but also the human experience in the natural world. She obtained her Master of Science in Education at Texas A&I University, now known as A&M, and received her Ph.D. in Art from the University of North Texas. She also took courses in marine science in response to a love of seashells and even took up scuba diving to expand her collection from the Philippines, Great Barrier Reef, and Costa Rica to Panama, the Canary Islands, and the Red Sea. Her collection at the Non-Vertebrate Paleontology Lab consists of over 20,000 specimens and 900 different species. Jean Andrews went on to receive the Distinguished Alumna Award from both the University of Texas and the University of North Texas, and she was the first woman to be named to the Hall of Honor in the College of Natural Sciences at the University of Texas. Jean Andrews was a woman of many disciplines and sought every opportunity to expand knowledge of her interests, and she wanted to aid graduate students who shared that same passion. Her tenacity, grit, and desire to overcome limitations led her to develop this fund for graduate students so they could have the same opportunities to meet the best and brightest experts in the field while advancing their training.
Just to elaborate on what Matthew has said, Jean Andrews also shared much in common with Dr. McTiernan, as she was a dedicated scholar, and in fact, she explored numerous subjects, including human nutrition, botany, marine biology, geology, and anthropology. Also, like Dr. McTiernan, she aspired to share her knowledge with the world, publishing over 10 books, including cookbooks, field guides, and her best-known book, Peppers, the Domesticated Capsicum, earning her the trademark nickname of the Pepper Lady. Jean Andrews also mirrored the generous nature of Dr. McTiernan, as she made it a point to help those in need, funding a co-op of women in Costa Rica to support their financial independence. Her support extended to students here at home, as she endowed 4 scholarships in memory of her daughter. An inquisitive spirit, we know that Jean Andrews would have been overjoyed to learn that Dr. McTiernan has graciously agreed to honor us as our next participant in the Jean Andrews Lectureship Series. So finally, before we begin, I just want to remind everyone to submit your questions to Dr. McTiernan using the Q&A function so we can address those at the end of the talk. Please also contact the host, Stephanie, via the chat feature if you encounter any technical difficulties. And with that, I will now hand it over to Dr. McTiernan. Please take it away.
Dr. McTiernan, I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now, I think. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and virtually, but in certainly in spirit as well. It's been incredibly an outstanding experience with the warmth and graciousness that my various hosts, Dr. Bray and others, have extended to me throughout this whole process. So it's really nice to see it come to fruition. And I'm very honored after learning about the origin of this honor, this award. And I was very interested to see that I was just the second woman that received this award. And so what I would hope is that we'll see many more women and people of color receive this award, because awards are important because they give recognition to people for the work they've done, but even more important, they give a roadmap to new people coming along. And we really, really need the input of women and people of color in research and nutrition and in health, because it really helps all of us. Thank you so much for that. And for tonight, I'm going to try to share my slides here. Let's see if I can find that. Should work. Okay, sorry about that little delay. So what I wanted to talk with you tonight about is about my work on weight and exercise and breast cancer. I realize that it's a very diverse audience with different backgrounds and expertise and interest. We may have people that are cancer survivors in the audience. We may have people that work with cancer patients, but then we have people in the general public or in the research community who just have a great interest in nutrition, physical activity, health, and in cancer in general. So the goal of the talk in the end is to be just talking about changing lifestyle. And these are the 4 things that I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about weight, keeping weight in the normal range, exercise regularly. We'll talk a little bit about what kind, how often, how much, a tiny bit about avoiding excess alcohol, and a little bit about diet changes. And certainly we can keep in mind that for weight, diet is critical. So diet's going to be a really important part of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. What I'm going to talk about is the research that I've been involved in, but then the totality of research. So I'm an epidemiologist, but I'm also a clinician. And in epidemiologists, we don't rely on the results of one study. We look at everything together. And so for an individual researcher, as we're coming up with guidelines, recommendation, we have to let go of your ego a little bit and look at what everybody else has done, not just what your own studies have done. So hopefully that's what I'll be doing tonight. So first, let's talk about weight and cancer, breast cancer. I'm going to focus on breast cancer tonight. I have an URL at the bottom here. It says WCRF. That stands for World Cancer Research Fund. And I've been lucky enough to work with them collaboratively over several years. This is a group that's set in England, but there's a US branch. And their mission is looking at nutrition and cancer. So that could be really near and dear to the heart of the nutrition department at UT Austin, because many of the people there are also looking at nutrition and cancer. But it's unusual for a foundation to do that. So they focus on that, and they contract people to do what are called meta-analyses, and that means looking at the totality of research. So I'll show you some research results from that. Some of it will look like graphs and it will look like research, but I'll walk you through that. That's the first one. So this is the more complicated slide that I have. So for those of you who don't look at this sort of research results in general, I'll just walk you through it. It's called a forest plot. And what I want to show you here are associations between weight and risk of developing breast cancer. And this slide focuses on postmenopausal breast cancer because that's the more common type of breast cancer. About 2/3 of breast cancers occur in postmenopausal women. So this is data that were compiled in what's called a meta-analysis from studies all over the world. About 50 studies were included. And these looked at the association between body mass index, that's just weight corrected for height, and risk of breast cancer. Each of these names refers to a study. Some of them were one study, some were compilations of studies. So that's when I say there are about 50 studies, is because in total about 50 studies. Each of these little squares refers to a summary result for that study. Each of these numbers here refers to amount of risk, but we'll just look at the squares here and look at the totality overall. There's a solid line here. If a square fell on that line, it means there's no association between weight corrected for height and risk of breast cancer. If it's to the right, it means it's increased. If it's to the left, it means it's decreased. And you can see all of these squares, almost all are falling to the right of the line. That means almost all the studies are showing increased risk of breast cancer with increased level of body mass index. There's a little diamond down here. And I like to say we kind of dazzled by a diamond because we like to look at a summary result. And that's what this little diamond down here is, the summary. Adding all those studies together, we see that the relative risk is 1.12. That means it's a 12% increased risk for every 5 points increase in body mass index. A 5 points increase in body mass index is a pretty big jump, but people range for body mass index between, say, 20 and 40 or 50 or more. So you can see that if somebody has obesity and has a large degree of obesity, they may have quite an increase in risk. So the other slides I show won't be as complicated, so I'll give you the hard one at first. Another measure of body size is waist circumference, and for most people, if you have a large waist circumference, that means that you have a lot of body fat. And you can see this line is just going up. Risk of breast cancer is going up significantly with increasing waist circumference. Again, this is for postmenopausal women. What about weight gain? Well, most of us get into the overweight or obese category by gaining weight over time. And that's indeed what we see here. With weight gain over time, the increased risk of breast cancer. And these results, again, are all from that meta-analysis that was done through the World Cancer Research Fund. What about weight loss? Well, some studies have looked at weight loss. As you can imagine, these studies many of them are conducted in the United States or in Western type of countries, and most people are not losing weight over time. Most are gaining weight over time. So there aren't as many studies, and there aren't as much data to show what happens with weight loss over time. But we do see that there's a significant reduction in risk of breast cancer in women who had lost weight over their lifetime. The studies had to have collected data at more than one point, weight and height, in order to know whether somebody lost weight or gained weight. But you can see for breast cancer that develops after menopause, the relative risk is, you can see this little diamond, it's a summary relative risk. It's to the left of that line. The risk is reduced by about 10% if they've lost any weight over their life. But the other thing is that you see about the same thing for premenopausal women. So losing weight, keeping your weight in the normal range is a healthy thing in terms of risk of breast cancer. What about after diagnosis of breast cancer? So I know there may be some survivors on the call, or oncologists, or other health professionals who work with cancer patients and survivors. And through the same organization, World Cancer Research Fund, we looked at body mass index, again, weight corrected for height, and prognosis after having breast cancer. And in this analysis, there were 82 studies with over 213,000 women. And we found that for each 5-unit increase in body mass index, remember that's weight corrected for height, we see increased risk of dying from breast cancer, 18% increase, 11% increased risk of dying from any cause, and then 13% increase in risk of developing a second breast cancer. What about physical activity in breast cancer? So are there things that can be done either to counteract the weight effect, or just for women at any weight that can be protective against breast cancer, or that can help people with breast cancer? So I was lucky enough to be involved with an effort in the United States to look at the totality of evidence. And this was through the U.S. Physical Activity Guidelines Committee. The U.S. government, in addition to doing diet guidelines every 5 years, does a physical activity guidelines effort every 10 years. And so I was able to sit on both of these committees and represent the cancer side of things. And we decided we wanted to answer a couple of questions related to cancer. We wanted to look at what is the relationship between physical activity and the cancer recurrence, risk of developing cancer. But then we also wanted to know, among cancer survivors, what's the relationship between physical activity and cancer recurrence or prognosis. We looked at the totality of evidence again. We looked at published data, however. The US government didn't have the funds to do meta-analyses for all of the questions we looked at. So we used published data. And in looking at these, we found 80 studies to look at in relation to prevention of breast cancer and 14 in relation to prognosis. And what did we find? So we found, looking at all that data together, we found strong evidence that women who were exercising regularly have a 20% lower risk for developing breast cancer. We found that exercise confers greater benefit if there's more exercise. So the more you do, the more benefit. We found there's no threshold. There's no lower limit below which you won't get benefit. And so what we summarized there is that exercising even a little bit is good and more is better. The whole committee had specific charges to look at associations between exercise and health across the spectrum of people living in the United States. And so when we looked at this for breast cancer risk, we didn't see much information on specific race and ethnic groups, with the exception that we were able to see one study that pooled many different studies together that did show that Black women do seem to have the same protection against breast cancer if they're physically active as do white women. But there wasn't enough information about what other race and ethnic groups. And we didn't have much information for women at high risk of breast cancer. Well, what about prognosis? So for women who already have breast cancer, we found there was moderate level evidence that women with breast cancer exercising regularly have a 40% lower risk of dying, either of breast cancer overall or of other causes. And also we found that more exercise may confer greater benefit. We call this dose response. But we still have questions. We don't know if it's a true relationship. Women who've had breast cancer who are going through treatment may have considerable amount of fatigue, and that may prevent them from wanting to exercise. So is it really that a woman has more advanced cancer that's keeping her from exercise, and that's what is causing the mortality, or is it the lack of exercise? And so we really felt that there needed to be better data before we could come up with a category of strong evidence, but at least it was promising, moderate level evidence. I'm just going to talk a little bit about alcohol. The World Cancer Research Fund also looked at many diet variables, including alcohol, and they concluded that 1 drink per day on average raises breast cancer risk. And for premenopausal women, it was increased by about 5% for each 1 drink a day on average, and postmenopausal was increased by about 9%. And so the guideline that they come up with for alcohol is to keep alcohol drinks to less than 1 drink per day on average. And when they define 1 drink per day as 4 ounces of wine or 8 ounces of beer or 1 ounce of liquor. And then finally, and I put a link here to World Cancer Research Fund because it's they have a great amount of information about these individual variables that they looked into. But it does seem there's some evidence that some particular dietary items might reduce risk of developing breast cancer, including non-starchy vegetables, foods containing carotenoids like fruits and vegetables, dairy products, and diets high in calcium. And some of these you'll recognize as being really important for dietary control of weight. So there's a lot of interconnection. Is it diet itself by itself, or is it weight control that's the most important? There's still a lot of research to be done to tease those apart. One thing to keep in mind about diet and physical activity, and in some cases weight, and risk of cancer or risk of any disease, is that for epidemiology data, it relies on self-report. And as you can imagine, people, especially in the United States, women tend to underreport their weight, perhaps overreport their height because they're reporting what their height was when they were quite young. their reporting of diet may reflect what they would like to eat and not necessarily what they are eating. It may not reflect everything that they're eating or how much they're eating, how many calories. And their reporting of alcohol similarly may be problematic. So there's a lot of error in all of these studies. And so what we're getting is an estimate and a global type of look at what might be happening. So I'm going to call this my spaghettigram, and this will be a background for what I'll talk about in the next part of the talk on the studies that we're doing in Seattle to try to tease apart some of this information. And just because there's a lot going on here, I just want to point out one thing here. Women who have high levels of body fat after menopause still make estrogens. Might be surprising, but even though ovaries shut down after menopause, women continue to make estrogens in their fat tissue. And if they have obesity, have a lot of fat tissue, they can have high estrogen levels. So we wanted to look using an experimental model in humans, which is a clinical trial. We wanted to see what happens. Can we get those estrogens lowered and reduce risk of breast cancer? Now, women who have breast cancer, some of them are treated with medicines that can lower estrogens, but we wanted to know, can we see an effect if we reduce estrogens through either exercise or weight control, weight loss? So we designed a series of clinical trials in women, got funding. That sounds easy. It's not. It's about the hardest part of doing research nowadays. And we tested what effects can achievable levels of exercise and weight loss have on breast cancer related biomarkers. So the goal is to look at things that women really could do. And we looked at long-term and short-term results. The first study I'll tell you about is called the PATH study. And the goal was to examine the effects of a 1-year regular moderate intensity exercise program in postmenopausal women who were overweight or had obesity on some individual things that we can measure in blood that are also, we know, are related to breast cancer. So in this type of talk, there isn't time to go into everything, but I'll just tell you the things we picked to look at were things we found in other ways were related to risk of breast cancer. So the main thing we were looking at was estrogens, but we looked at additional things we could test in blood, and in some places we tested in other body tissues. In this study, we enrolled 173 women that were postmenopausal, not using hormones, and they were age 50 to 79, 50 to 75. They were in the overweight or obese category by their body mass index level. And we assigned them by chance. We call it randomizing to either an exercise program or a control program. And the exercise program consisted of 45 minutes a day of moderate activity or for 5 days a week. And the control group was just gentle stretching. And then we followed these women for a year. And what did we find out? Don't worry about reading all this. It's kind of complicated, but the women did very well. We only had 2 women drop out of the study, and they met 80% of their goals, so they did great. Their cardiorespiratory fitness went up. They lost some body fat, and this is our main study goal: estrogens. We looked at estrogens. They went down by 12 to 20%, but they only went down if they lost weight. And in our study, all the weight loss was fat mass. So it's really, if they lost fat, then their estrogens went down. And I've left all these other markers on there for those people that are on the call that are scientists and are interested in that. But for the main point I wanted to point out is that we do see some estrogen change. We also got a little bit of press when this, because one of our papers was looking at body fat, and we measured the people's body fat with DEXA scans and with CT scans. We're able to see just how much fat there was in individuals' abdominal area by measuring a CT scan with just one picture. And this was in the day before COVID, when news media actually were interested in other health things besides COVID. So we got quite a bit of press because of this one study. But because of the results of that one exercise study, we were interested, we saw that exercise had an effect, but only if the women lost body fat. Any of you who've tried to lose weight and decided to start exercising and realize you're not losing much weight is seeing what really happens. Exercise does not cause much weight loss. Our women lost only about 1 or 2 kilograms over the year. They lost body fat, but they didn't lose a huge amount. So we wanted to test what would happen if we tested whether women could lose weight through a dietary weight loss program, either with or without exercise, and see what effect that might have, again, on estrogens. Again, looking at other cancer-related biomarkers. We enrolled in this study 438 women. They were also all postmenopausal, 50 to 75 years old, and then they were in the overweight or obese category. And we randomly assigned them by chance into one of 4 groups. One was an exercise program, the exact same as in the previous study. One was a diet program. This was a healthy diet, high vegetable, fruit, lower fat, reduced calorie diet with a goal of losing 10% of their body fat or of their weight over 6 months and then continue for the following 6 months. And then if they were randomized or put into a diet and exercise program, they were in both, they had both interventions. And then we had a control group. And what did we find? Again, the exercise program, the women did a great job. They met 80% of their goal. And the women in either the diet or diet plus exercise group lost 10% of their starting weight. So if somebody weighed 200 pounds, then they lost 20 pounds. So we had a very good effect in terms of those interventions. And we did find very strong effects. The estrogens decreased by 20 to 25%. And again, all these other endpoints, results, I'm putting up there for those people that are scientists in the audience. But the important thing is that weight loss through a diet plus exercise program had the greatest effect. What we really saw also is that more weight loss produced greater effect. So those women who lost at least 5%, those who lost 10% had greater effect than those that just lost a smaller amount. So the more weight loss, the more effect. And for some of the women, we're able to follow them over almost 2 years. And we saw some evidence of continued effect over that period of time. And the final study I'll just mention we have ongoing now. And this started in the time of COVID. So it did, like many people's studies, did have to start and stop, but it's ongoing again. And this is called the ACE study. What we're interested in this one, because we previously looked in our 2 trials in women, we looked at long-term effects. 1 year is what we're looking at, 1 year of intervention. We're wondering what happens the day that you exercise. So we know in other fields, so that in terms of a diabetes risk, people who have diabetes or are at risk of diabetes, if they exercise, they get beneficial biological effects that day. Their glucose, blood glucose gets in better control the very day that they exercise. And some people with diabetes find they exercise twice a day to get that benefit that lasts through the entire day. Similar things happen to blood pressure. Blood pressure effects from exercise happen that day. We're wondering now, what about cancer-related effects? Things that can be measured in blood or muscle, because we're collecting muscle. Can you see effects that day that might help? And that will tell us whether people should be advised to exercise every day, or whether the goal amount of exercise should be can be concentrated in a couple of days. So this is a smaller study. We're looking at several biomarkers. We're looking at the effect of a 45-minute bout of moderate intensity exercise on several things related to breast cancer. We're randomly assigning 100 women into either a 45-minute bout of exercise or a control group. So a much easier study than our previous ones. So that's ongoing, luckily. And then to summarize the results of what all this research has shown, we've shown that increased weight is associated with increased risk of breast cancer. High levels of physical activity is associated with lower risk. We've shown with our human experimental studies that there's a biological effect of weight loss and physical activity that's related to breast cancer. And we've shown dose response effects. But all of this has a leap of faith because we don't have clinical trials telling us that exercise actually reduces the incidence of breast cancer or reduces mortality from breast cancer. And we don't have this for weight loss studies, not yet. There's some clues that might be coming in the future. And in cancer patients, there are some studies ongoing. But I call it a leap of faith to think that these, to summarize that the epidemiology studies, and these human experimental trials that data together can link us to be able to come up with guidelines. And I use this picture. I like to get a picture of my grandchildren in there because these little boys, the cousin and brother, are trying to take a leap of faith by following their cousin, the big sister. So guidelines for reducing risk of breast cancer. Some guidelines are weight loss, and this is what we use. This is our program, but it's the same program as the diabetes prevention program. That weight loss of, excuse me, a weight loss program that includes reduced calorie, increased physical activity, weekly meetings with behavior change trained nutritionists, self-monitoring, and then a goal of about 10% weight loss in 6 months is reasonable. For people with obesity or overweight, the general guidelines for what to do, I've listed several medications that are also FDA approved. And then there is also bariatric surgery. So for individuals that try weight loss through physical activity and diet, if they're not getting as much as they want in terms of results, there are other options. None of these have been FDA approved for breast cancer. And to my knowledge, none have been tested in breast cancer patients or survivors. For physical activity, recommendations for prevention and prognosis, they're pretty much the same. These are the US physical activity guideline recommendations of 150 minutes to 300 minutes a week of moderate activity. Vigorous activity can be replace this to reduce the number of minutes that are needed. The guidelines do recommend muscle strength training twice per week. And then for survivors, muscle strengthening has not been shown to be adverse in terms of effects on lymphedema or other adverse effects. So it's something that's reasonable for survivors as well. Other recommendations, just move more, sit less. And then for breast cancer survivors, the committee recommends that they follow the general guidelines for prevention, but also to keep in mind what they're able to do. And so we always say it's best to check with your medical team of what's good for you. The recommendations that ASCO has, American Society for Clinical Oncology, are very similar to what I've talked about before in terms of how to handle obesity for cancer patients, what types of diet, what types of physical activity to follow. And then finally, there are available programs that people can be referred to. Livestrong does have a YMCA program that's been tested and shown to be efficacious. The American College of Sports Medicine provides a link so that people can find exercise trainers that are that have been trained in working with cancer survivors. So I'm going to finish there. Molly very nicely showed the books that I had published. That's my 2 memoirs, which are available. Anybody can order them through bookstores or through Amazon. And I'll finish with a picture of the Mount Rainier and our cancer center in Seattle on Lake Union. Thank you.
Wonderful, great talk. Thank you so much, Dr. McTiernan. We are going to start the question and answer session. So if you haven't already, please go to the Q&A box to submit your question. Check through what's already been asked. If you see that you have a question up there that you would like answered, hit that thumbs up button. That will like it and move it up higher on the queue to make sure it gets answered. So I'll give you just a second. So let's start off, Dr. McTiernan. We got a question that says, does any of this research take familial incidence of breast cancer into consideration?
This is a really important question. And for those who don't follow it, there are some gene mutations that put people at very high risk of breast cancer. There are some other more common mutations that might increase risk, but not to the same degree as some of the others. There's been very little research in those populations to know whether people at very high risk or moderate risk get the same effects from these interventions, from these lifestyle factors. I think there was perhaps about 1 cohort that looked at women with very high risk, so women with the BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, and it looks like there's reduced risk with exercise for that group. But it's just not, there aren't that many studies, and there wasn't enough to summarize it in these looking at very large studies or the totality of data. But it's certainly an area of research that needs to be answered.
Awesome. All right, we had a couple questions about when you had mentioned foods that reduce or increase the risk of breast cancer. So the first one was coffee reported among the foods that reduce or increase the risk of breast cancer?
The World Cancer Research Fund does look at coffee when they look at various cancers, and it didn't show up as something that's reducing risk of breast cancer.
All right. And then we had another one about dairy products. So this attendee said, very valuable presentation, Dr. McTiernan. Thank you. I was puzzled by what you displayed relating to dairy products. I always thought that dairy products with animal fat in them, of course, contributed to the incidence of cancer, not the other way around.
Yeah, looking at the summary of epidemiology data, that's not what was seen. It looked like in total, people with a high dairy diet had a reduced risk. I think that one of the issues that we deal with in studies in people is that things get reported, and they're reported in the news as one day a study says something increases risk, another day something decreases risk. And for all of us, that's very confusing. Now, I find I'm attracted to the news to see what that new study is too. But it's really when you look at the totality of data, and that's why I presented that in the beginning, the data, the studies from World Cancer Research Fund, where they looked at everything that had been done before and added it all together. And the same thing for what we did with the US physical activity guidelines work. And so what we're doing is adding all the studies together and seeing what we see overall, and kind of doing that work for the public, because when you just are seeing things, one study one day in the news and another study another day, it's impossible to know what's going on overall.
Yeah, that's great. Next question, does exercise counter effects of alcohol for breast cancer?
That's an extremely common question that I've gotten. And when we presented the results of that analysis to the public, I was getting that question from reporters all the time. And I wish I knew the answer, but we didn't, those studies didn't have the ability to look at one versus the other, so to see if somebody is drinking, does exercise reduce that effect? But it would be a good question. If you're doing something that increases your risk, can you do something that will decrease? There is some effort to look at that association in terms of weight. So looking at in people that have high levels of body fat and people that are overweight or obese, do they get the same benefit from exercise as people who are normal weight? And while it looks like they do get some benefit, you see more benefit in the people who are lighter weight. So there is some interaction there, but it looks like the main recommendation is try to do as many of these things as possible. It's most likely, if you can follow these lifestyle factors as well as you can, as well as you can fit them in your lifestyle, you'll get more benefit.
All right, that makes sense. All right, next question. Does race impact weight effects? That first study, the World Cancer Research Fund that I mentioned, they did not have enough data on individual race ethnicities to be able to answer that question. But if you look at those individual studies, some of them were focused on specific race or ethnic groups. And it really does look like you see that same sort of that same effect of weight across race ethnic groups. So women who are Black, women who are Latina, women who are Asian American, if they're in the highest, or I should say race Asian, because more of the studies in Asians have been done in other countries. But there does seem to be an effect of weight across race and ethnic groups. Okay. For an exercise program, is it percentage of weight loss or a goal BMI that better reduces risk?
It really seemed to be a change in weight, but body mass index is not quite as precise as weight. It takes more to move your body mass index than it does to lose a couple of kilograms in terms of moving that number. So I would say focus on weight.
Okay, another exercise question. Is there a difference between the effects of resistance versus aerobic exercise?
There have been some small studies and small exercise studies in humans that are trying to look into this. In terms of the epidemiology, they're relying on what people are doing. And historically, when these studies were started, when they were asking women what they did, most women were not doing resistance exercise. So it's really not possible to answer that. And in fact, most of the exercise people did, if you're asking women, most of it is going to be walking. But if you look at a population and see what people are doing for exercise, for women and for anybody in the middle age and older ages, it's about 70% will say walking. So yeah, we don't have the answer for large scale studies on resistance.
All right, the next one, was there a significant change in basal metabolic rate among the different groups? I'm not sure which study this was referring to.
We didn't have the equipment to measure that, sorry.
Okay, what impact does metformin appear to have on risk and survival of breast cancer?
Yeah, metformin is a medication that's used as a treatment for diabetes. It helps with insulin resistance. It's also used, been shown in people with prediabetes to reduce risk of diabetes. Because high levels of insulin are associated with increased risk of breast cancer, people are interested in that medication for breast cancer risk and for promotion. For progression. So there is one clinical trial ongoing now that's run through NCI Canada, looking at the effect of metformin versus placebo on prognosis in breast cancer patients. So that study's not finished yet, but so that's one answer for people with breast cancer. There's enough interest to do a large-scale clinical trial. In terms of epidemiology, in terms of risk of breast cancer, there are some intriguing studies suggesting that women who use metformin and or diabetic tend to have lower risk of developing breast cancer than women who are diabetic and using other medications. The problem with that is a little bit of problem because women who are using metformin only tend to have a little bit better control of their diabetes than women who have to use multiple medications. So it's a little difficult to look at in epidemiologic studies.
Yeah. Next question, any research regarding meat versus plant-based diets and breast cancer occurrence?
There's more interest in that, and there are new studies looking at that. We didn't look at that in the World Cancer Research Fund extensively because there weren't enough studies looking at dietary patterns like that, but more people are looking at that.
Another diet question, is there a difference of the type of diet to lose weight as opposed to just losing weight in general?
Well, the type of diet we looked at was a reduced fat, reduced calorie diet to produce weight loss. And certainly there are other diets that can produce weight loss of similar amounts. We don't know if those have the same effect on estrogens, however. I don't know if those have been tested.
Another exercise question, does it matter if the exercise is spread out over the week or concentrated on the weekend?
Yeah, we don't know. Those epidemiology studies didn't ask that level of detail. We just know amount, how much exercise somebody was doing, what kind of an effect that had.
Okay. We have one, I had a question about whether sleep has an effect on breast cancer due to lowered melatonin levels causing an increased risk of cancer growths.
Yeah, this years ago, and especially the Nurses' Health Study looked at sleep or light at night, people that worked overnight to see if they had increased risk of breast cancer. And there does seem to be some interest there, or some signals there. One of the issues, however, with sleep problems is that people who have low levels of sleep, problematic sleep, have other things going on, and it's difficult to tell what it is. So if somebody has poor level sleep, they may have a change in their appetite the following day, maybe eat more, eat different kinds of foods. They may exercise less. So there's an awful lot of confounding going on with other variables. So it's pretty difficult to tell.
Yeah. Are the findings for breast cancer and exercise in women similar to that for men?
There's been very little done in men, and so I don't think we really have an answer in men. The risk of developing breast cancer in men is only about 1% of what we see in women. So there's very little research in men, unfortunately.
Okay, the WCRF website says being overweight or obese in adulthood before menopause decreases the risk of premenopausal breast cancer. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So WCRF is the World Cancer Research Fund, and I didn't put that into this presentation because it's a conundrum. We don't know what it is. We report on it. We see it in many studies. So obesity in young ages decreases risk of breast cancer for both young and older women. And obesity in general decreases risk of premenopausal breast cancer. We don't know why. There's some evidence that women who have obesity as young women have lower levels of estrogens. It's almost, and they may have some changes to their ovulation, their monthly menses patterns, which then would lower estrogen levels. But that's pretty theoretical. To my knowledge, they have not been studied well enough to know that that's really what the effect is and why that association might be there. But in terms of public health guidelines, nobody feels comfortable to recommend that people become obese in their young years in order to reduce risk of breast cancer, because there are many other health issues that they may have to deal with their obesity. So the guidelines usually are keep this healthy lifestyle lifelong.
Right. Do the diet studies use food frequency questionnaires for reporting of foods consumed?
That's right. Almost all of the epidemiology studies, these large-scale studies that are trying to look at diet, almost all relied on food frequency questionnaires. So that's, for those of you not in the diet field, that's where people are asked, or they're given a list of maybe 80 to 150 foods and beverages, asked to check off how often they have something, and an estimate of how much they might have at the time. These things, these questionnaires may pertain quite well to a local population, might not be relevant to another population, so they're often targeted to a particular geographic area or a particular cultural group, but it may not all be accurate. And they all rely on self-report. So they're really looking at patterns and preferences rather than actual amount of food and exactly what people are eating. So there's a lot of error with them.
Yeah. I have one last question for you. Do you think the dairy effect, we talked about dairy earlier, do you think the dairy effect is due to the vitamin D content?
It's not clear. There's great interest in vitamin D, and we do see that people with higher levels of vitamin D in their blood, so that's where the measure is better than a food frequency questionnaire. The high level of vitamin D in blood does associate with reduced risk of getting breast cancer, and perhaps even with better prognosis. Of course, vitamin D in foods is one source, but a great source of vitamin D is sun exposure. And then there's also the confounding effects of whether the person uses sunscreen, has sun exposure, or how much clothing they have on. So there's a lot of variability there. But if it's measured in blood, it's pretty well measured, and then that's where we see an association.
I'm going to sneak one more question in. So going back to the food frequency questionnaires, what degree of accuracy do you suspect there is regarding reporting?
Yeah, I think I mentioned there, it's definitely a problem with accuracy for many different variables and for many different food variables with food frequency. So every time we're looking at food patterns and risk of developing cancer or any disease, it's always just an estimate. It gives you a snapshot, but it's not. It's very difficult to base a guideline on based on those self-reported variables.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know there probably are some more questions people want to ask, but Dr. McTiernan does need to go to another event after this, so we're going to close it here. We want to thank you on behalf of the Department of Nutritional Sciences and the Graduate Student Association for everyone that attended, and Dr. McTiernan for coming to speak for us. We look forward to seeing all of you attendees at future seminars. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.